Ebola, smallpox, sleeping. All these diseases are heard to this day. Smallpox, which we defeated a long time ago, but which, until 1980, was a real curse of humanity. Ebola is an incurable deadly fever that recently broke out in West Africa and claimed tens of thousands of lives, striking the whole world with horror. AIDS, as a result of the human immunodeficiency virus, from which there is no sensible vaccine or medicine that would allow us to get rid of it once and for all. These are loud and undoubtedly terrible diseases, but they all pale in comparison with our hero today, a contender for the name of the most monstrous and most rapid infection that has ever struck humanity. Meet the Spaniard. Like a scythe of death, she raced around the world, looked into every corner, did not miss a single village, island or high-altitude area. In just a year, she was able to take away as many lives as the First and Second World Wars combined did not take away. It was undoubtedly the worst pandemic in the history of mankind, but not the largest in percentage terms. In the world, about 5% of the entire population died from it. Every third person died from the same plague in the 14th century, but it was the Spaniard who had to top the list of the most massive and deadly disease, since neither quarantine nor precautionary measures acted on her. She just came and gathered her harvest of sorrow, disappeared without a trace. Many believed in the end of the world, as it very much resembled a biblical prophecy. About a war that will strike the world, followed by famine, followed by a pale horse, and on it a rider whose name is Death, and hell will follow him. And it's hard for me to blame these poor people, since the virus in some remote villages destroyed up to 95% of the entire adult population. For the difference and the rate of spread of the flu was simply colossal. The victims died 2 or 3 days after they became infected. Sometimes patients did not live for more than a day. At one time, jokes even began to appear among the people, the essence of which was about the following. Last night 4 ladies gathered to play bridge, and in the morning 3 of them died. One nurse from the English rating once wrote in her diary. It all happened quite suddenly. In the morning we received an order to open a new department for flu patients, and by the evening we moved to the premises of the girls' school provided to us. And not even all the desks had time to be taken out, and in each class, patients were already placed at 60 to 80 people per room. We could barely squeeze between the rows of beds, and my God, how these people suffered. They were brought from the neighboring base to the Air Force, and some lay for several days without receiving any help. Everyone got pneumonia, and soon we already knew that those with blackened feet would not survive. And first of all, it was not the elderly and children who were vulnerable, as with the usual flu, but young and healthy people. The disease seized people in a matter of days, and sometimes hours, and completely knocked them off their feet. Yesterday everything was fine, but now my head is splitting, an unbearable shiver runs through me, my eyes are inflamed, the temperature is rising higher and higher, the vision is becoming more delusional, and sleep is more restless. After that, irreparable symptoms appear. The complexion turns purple-brown, squeezes the throat more and more, and when the end approaches, every breath is painfully hard, as if drowning. And silence. And of the signs of life, only bloody saliva dripping down a dark-colored cheek. The curtain. Later, during the autopsy, the doctor will notice that the patient's lungs are filled to capacity with liquid, oxygen simply could not get into them. And dark feet and complexion, as a result of cyanosis. Confirmation of that. In the United States in 1918, about 30% of the population was infected. According to the Navy, 40% of the personnel had the flu, and the death rate from the Spanish was on average 25 times higher than from the usual flu. 2.5% of all cases. And if this figure seems small to you, then the mortality rate from the common flu is only 0.1%. The problem was that the flu was spreading at such a rate that it was simply impossible to determine the overall picture of mortality, and statistics were simply not kept in many areas. And according to rough estimates, from 50 to 100 million people died from influenza in the world, although the official figures are much more modest for obvious reasons. But this is not all that is worth knowing about the pandemic of the 18th year. It is considered to be the only epidemic of the Spanish flu, but in fact it passed through the world in 3 waves, 2 in the 18th and 1 in the 19th. The first wave hit the measure at the end of the winter of the 18th year. It all started from the place that was destined to christen this virus specifically Spanish. While fighting raged in burning, dilapidated Europe, it was here, in San Sebastian, in a small resort town in the very north of Spain, very close to the border with France, that the abnormal activity of the virus was first recorded. At first, the city authorities did not take the problem seriously, and, in fact, they did not want to do otherwise, since the holiday season was in full swing. However, at first things were not so bad. 3 days of fever, pain, aches in the body, and then recovery. The outbreak of the disease was considered insignificant. The mortality rate is not higher than usual, which means there is no need to scare away tourists. However, the problem was that it was not an ordinary mushroom. Although his first wave was really not so deadly, everyone noticed the monstrous contagiousness of this disease. After a couple of days, almost everyone who came into contact with patients in one way or another became infected. The disease has become simply impossible to control, and it has also become useless to keep silent about it. Reports of outbreaks began to come from different districts and cities of Spain, and this information quickly found its reader. Within a few weeks, newspapers were full of headlines that a new flu was conquering Spain city by city, and just a few months later it covered almost the entire country. Almost a third of the population of Madrid was infected with the flu, and there were about 8 million people infected in the country, including King Alphonse XIII himself. Among the people, the flu has firmly become associated with Spain, for which it received such an uncomplicated name. But the fact that the disease was given a name based on geographical considerations does not mean at all that the disease appeared in Spain itself. It's just that Spain was a neutral country, and the authorities, although at first they wanted to avoid unnecessary panic in the press, did not introduce any censorship. But the United States, Germany, or Great Britain, the news that soldiers continue to be massively infected with some new incomprehensible disease could do a lot of harm. Therefore, the countries involved in the war strenuously kept silent and forbade any publication about the disease in newspapers. At the front, she was nicknamed the 3-day Lycomenka, but according to the soldiers' recollection, she was not always limited to 3 days. She is called a 3-day daredevil here, but this will not deceive anyone, because sometimes she lasts a week or even longer. The disease occurs suddenly and the patient's temperature jumps so that mercury almost breaks through the top of the thermometer. My face turns red, every bone starts to hurt, and my head just splits. This goes on for 3 days, maybe 4, and then, having thoroughly sweated, the patient recovers. Although, to be honest, a hangover can still be felt for a week or 2. Unlike the second wave, which began in the fall, the first wave was almost not documented. Perhaps because it was not so deadly, or maybe because everyone was busy with the war and keeping statistics was considered something almost wasteful in terms of time and even waste of paper, since you understand the war, all resources and attention are focused on it. In the warring countries, the flu spread primarily in military camps, where recruits were trained and literally on the battlefields. It would be remiss not to say that this was reflected in the military actions themselves. Commanders on all fronts complained in dispatches about the incapacity of their divisions in the light of the outbreak of fever. In May, the ships of the fleet of the United Kingdom could not go to sea for 3 weeks due to the fact that more than 10,000 sailors were listed as ill. The famous German General Erich von Ludendorff complained of Flemish fever, as it was called in Germany. He complained that the flu weakened soldiers who were already in a bad position of body and spirit. He claimed that she was the reason for the disruption of the July offensive, which was supposed to guarantee Germany's victory in this war. And, according to him, there was nothing more depressing than listening to the reports of the chiefs of staff every morning, who called the number of sick people and cried about the weakness of their divisions. Despite the fact that the first wave was extremely contagious and quite large-scale, it still did not cover the whole world. It practically did not affect Canada, Latin America, and most of Africa. And then summer came at all, long humid hot days came, and the virus seemed to disappear by itself, leaving the military to fight, and civilians to hope for a speedy end to the war. Autumn followed the summer, the war began to come to its logical conclusion, but the virus was not going to reckon with people's plans at all. Having died down in the spring and subsided a little in the summer, he waited to strike with renewed force at war-weary humanity. If the first wave was super contagious, then the second, in addition to this, easily killed its victims. About 20% of the patients suffered the flu quite normally. They rested for 3 days or 3 days and immediately got back on their feet, while all the others were already divided into 2 categories. The first group included those who were brought to the grave by the disease very rapidly, filling their lungs with fluid to the point of failure. But the second category consisted of those who had the flu as usual, 3 or 4 days in a fever with a high temperature, but after a while they were overtaken by an equally dangerous bacterial infection at that time, as a result of which severe pneumonia developed, and the patient either died or recovered for more than 1 week and was in general incapacitated. The beginning of the second wave in America is considered to be the 28th of August, 1918. It happened in Boston, when at first 8 sailors fell ill, and the next day there were already 58 patients. A few days later, the number of infected grew to 81 people, and a week later 119 people were listed as sick. Around the same time, on the 8th of September, the first deaths began. 3 died at once. On the same day, the flu swept nearby Fort Davins, and according to one of the doctors, a real hell on earth reigned there. A letter dated September 29, 1918, with a simple signature Roy, apparently never reached the addressee. It was discovered only 60 years later in a chest in Detroit. Neither the surname nor the further fate of the author is unknown. The camp at Davins was located near Boston, and there are about 50,000 people living in it. Or, rather, they lived before this terrible epidemic broke out. The fungus had been brought into the camp 4 weeks earlier, he added, and spread so terrifyingly quickly that the personnel were completely demoralized, and the entire preparatory program was suspended until the situation normalized. The strictest ban has been imposed on any contacts between recruits. The onset of the disease, Roy wrote, resembles an ordinary mushroom, but what happens after the soldiers, when they are already taken to the medical unit, they quickly develop the most sinister type of pneumonia of all known medical science. 2 hours after arrival, reddish spots appear on their cheekbones, and a few hours later, cyanosis can be observed spreading from the ears all over the face to such an extent that it is impossible to distinguish a white man from a Negro afterwards. After that, death soon occurs, breathing becomes more and more difficult and the patient dies from suffocation. It's terrible. You can bear the sight of the death of 1, 2, or even 20 people, but these poor devils die like flies and such a sight is simply maddening. On average, we are now registering about 100 deaths per day, but their number continues to grow. Even getting rid of the accumulated corpses has become a problem. We had to use special trains to take out the dead. Coffins were not delivered for several days, and the bodies kept piling up. And when we entered the morgue, it was just behind my ward. More than once we could contemplate the unfortunate boys laid in long rows. You won't see this even after the fiercest fight in France. Then the podmorgues liberated the largest barracks, and hardly anyone could remain indifferent if he happened to walk along the corpses dressed in uniforms and stacked in stock. No one has been sent to help us yet, and so we get up at 5:30 in the morning, work without breaks until 9:30 in the evening and go to sleep so that everything will repeat tomorrow. Within just a few weeks, such a picture prevailed in absolutely all corners of the country, especially in places where a huge number of people were gathering, in particular recruits who were supposed to be trained and go to Europe burning with fire. But despite the fact that reinforcements were needed more than ever, the Army Command issued a shocking statement about the cancellation of the draft of 142,000 recruits. It was also announced the introduction of quarantine in all military units where these very recruits were stationed. But there was nothing to be done. The virus broke free and turned a bustling country into one huge funeral procession in a few weeks. The virus moved step by step from one army unit to another, from city to city, until it finally reached Philadelphia. At first, the city authorities hastened to reassure people, telling them that in fact the outbreak is already coming to its logical conclusion and that there is no need to be afraid and panic. The authorities not only did not declare quarantine, they also staged a large-scale parade in honor of raising funds for the war fund, which attracted more than 200,000 people. Moreover, the very next day, headlines began to flash in the newspapers that scientists had managed to find out the causative agent of the disease that causes the flu, the very Pfeiffer bacillus. But already on the 1st of October, on this day alone, the public health authorities received a message about 635 cases of influenza. 3 days later, absolutely all establishments, restaurants, theaters, schools, even churches were closed in the city. The strictest quarantine was introduced, and people were notified on the streets about the insecurity of sneezing and coughing in public places. Only hospitals and funeral homes were operating in an enhanced mode. This week alone, 2,600 deaths from influenza or its complications were registered in Philadelphia. A week later, this figure doubled. Hundreds of thousands of citizens were infected, patients were taken to hospitals on whatever they could. On cars, carts and even on ordinary wheelbarrows. 11,000 people died from the flu during the month of the illness in the city. The saddest day fell on the date of October 10, 1918, when 759 people died from the flu in just one day. The funeral homes simply could not cope with the load, in the process they could walk the streets all day long. The bodies lay at home for several days. It was literally impossible to find a free bureau in the city that could bury the body. There were absolutely not enough places in the morgue, and, according to Alfred Crosby, bodies were stored in 4 or 5 rows in the city morgue, even in corridors and in rooms not intended for this purpose. Moreover, they were mostly covered with dirty, blood-stained sheets. Most were not embalmed, there was not enough ice either, and the corpses decomposed, spreading a sickening stench around. The doors of the building were almost constantly kept open for better ventilation, and the Grand Guignoli-style horrors were revealed to everyone who looked inside, including young children. Philadelphia. This is probably the most affected city in America, in which the virus managed to roam in a big way. But America. This is far from the most affected country by the virus. In Russia, the epidemic was initially mistaken for the pneumonic plague, since the Spaniard was not very attracted to the usual flu. Telegrams sometimes came from the place, directly talking about plague-like diseases. This was also prompted by the presence of 6 sticks in the secretions, very similar to the plague. Plus the Pfeiffer bacillus, which everyone then discussed as a possible causative agent of the flu. Almost no one knew about viruses at that time. The mortality rate was no lower than in other countries. The only difference is that isolated remote settlements in Russia suffered the disease much harder than the rest of its inhabitants. But this feature was inherent not only in the territory of the former Russian Empire. This happened in all remote corners of the planet. On some islands, up to 30% of the adult population died out, and this is still not enough. A very good example of this is a village near the Lutheran mission in Teller, Alaska. The disease came here at the end of November, when 2 guests came to the chapel, saying that the flu had broken out in the town, but in the neighborhood. The Eskimos received guests according to all traditions, but did not pay much attention to it. Big deal, flu. After a couple of days, the first person in the village fell ill, and the next day there was already the first death. The priest immediately went to Teller, which was only 14 miles away, for help, as every day the disease claimed more and more lives. But when he returned to the village, he realized that there was no one to save, and in principle there was nothing. The disease could not be cured either by prayers or shamanic dances with a tambourine. Then almost the entire adult population died in the village. There were only 5 surviving adults and 47 children. A total of 72 people died. For a long time, the problem was simply to bury the corpses, since this is Alaska, this is permafrost. They were put in a separate needle, so that they could be buried later. But the dogs, maddened by hunger, made a dig and broke into the igloo and tore up several corpses. And this situation was in all the neighboring villages. The Spaniard walked across the planet, not sorting people into her own and strangers, but killing mainly the young population. This mysterious disease has claimed the lives of about 20 million people in India alone, and after hundreds of years, there are more questions than answers. Despite the extensive nature of the pandemic, there are practically no memories of those truly horrific events in the public consciousness. According to Crosby's surveys, most people considered the pandemic of the 18th year to be something local and exclusively inherent in their city, village, or street in general. Any other event of these times has been firmly etched into the memory of every person, community, family. The horrors of the war have found a wide response in the public consciousness, 1,000 works of art, autobiographies, memoirs. These events are still included in all history textbooks as a life-shaping event of those times. But deadly Spanish women, even in the best textbooks, only a couple of words can be found. The question also remains why the Spaniard of the first wave turned out to be so easy, while the second wave took a more dangerous turn. The Spaniard also differed from her predecessors in that she struck mainly young people from 17 to 45 years old. But why exactly so? After all, we are used to associating the flu with something safe and certainly not serious, especially for a young body. And the most important question is, where did it come from? After all, the Spanish flu pandemic is not the first and far from the last case of a pandemic in the history of mankind. The mushroom as a phenomenon has firmly entered the culture and confidently settled in it, periodically getting on the pages of the chronicles of both ancient authors and authors of medieval Europe. And in order to understand how the Spaniard managed to cause so many troubles in such a short time, and how we can avoid such disasters in the future, it is worth first of all to find out where she came from. In search of an answer, we will fast forward 70 years ago, to 1951 year, to a remote corner of America in Alaska, where in 1918 the Spaniard passed with all her might, sometimes killing up to 90% of the adult population and destroying the habitual way of life of local residents. And to better understand this topic, let's look at it through the eyes of a young enthusiast named Johann Holten. Johann was an exchange student and in 1949 year, together with his wife, he moved to the United States to work and study, because, according to him, America was a country of freedom, not subject to class stereotypes and conservatism, which was inherent in Swedish science at that time. And since they were easygoing people, and they still had a lot of time to spend in America, they decided to see the country. We borrowed a small passenger Studebaker from my wife's relatives in the 47th year and decided to hit the road. After visiting 48 states, Johann and his wife decided to move north to Alaska. I had to go through Canada, and when half of the country was already behind me, it turned out that in order to continue along the Alcan Highway, the only one at that time, by the way, it was necessary to get a pass from the Ministry of Defense. However, just at this time, the government of Canada opened the highway for civilians and the couple managed to continue their journey. When they got to Fairbanks, they were incredibly lucky again. They met with a paleontologist named Otto Gates, who offered them to work for him for a few weeks and master the difficult craft of a digger, to a difficult digger, and a digger in permafrost conditions, which our hero will need in the future. And now you are probably thinking, what is all this story about and what does it have to do with the flu virus? But if you have listened to me carefully before, then you will surely begin to have suspicions about what this is all about. And while you're thinking, I'll continue. Returning to Iowa, Holten began studying at the university, where he eventually won the respect of his fellow professors by inventing a mechanism for automatically turning off the gas burner, which in laboratory conditions was simply a salvation. And one day he was invited to a dinner in honor of the arrival at the University of William Hale, a famous virologist from the National Laboratory in New Haven. Holten was introduced to him precisely as the same guy from Sweden who modernized the Bundin burner, which facilitated the work of probably all laboratories in the world. That day, Hale uttered the words of the Spanish flu pandemic, which were destined to become prophetic and which stuck in Holten's head for many years. It seems that everything possible has already been done to shed light on the source of the epidemic, but we still do not know anything about the causative agent of this scourge. The only thing left for us now is to go to the northern regions of the world and try to find bodies in the permafrost that are well preserved enough to still contain the flu virus. Fortunately, a little earlier, Holten, who plowed the expanses of permafrost, had already succeeded in establishing contact with local residents and gained enough knowledge to detect this virus and, most importantly, to dig it out. He immediately began planning the project, working with maps and calculations of the places where burials were to remain in the permafrost, which did not disturb the warm summer air and did not betray the buried bodies to decomposition. Perhaps there is still a virus in the lungs of corpses that could be isolated and studied. And already on the basis of this knowledge, it would be possible to create a vaccine and prevent a future pandemic of this terrible disease. And finally understand what really made the Spanish flu virus so deadly. Holton shared the idea with his supervisor, rector, and other specialists of the university. He told them how he had previously studied the soil of those places with his wife and that he had sufficient skills and, most importantly, unbridled enthusiasm to take up this adventure. Everyone immediately liked the idea very much, and the college management approved the development of a plan for the exhumation of the bodies of the permafrost and their delivery to the laboratory for further study. Holton's first act was to telegraph to his good friend Gates in Alaska. It was in him that the key to solving the problem lay, which not only Holton was interested in, but also a group of scientists who were interested in the project. It was Gates, using his indisputable authority among the local population, who had to find out from the Eskimos the complete lists of people who died that year. But that's still half the battle. It was necessary to persuade the Eskimos to give their permission to dig. The Eskimos were no different from other representatives of humanity in reverence for their buried ancestors and really needed someone who could convince. Fortunately, Gates was just such a person and gladly agreed to help, taking on some of the worries of the mission. And Holton, enlisting the help of Gates, began a long correspondence with representatives of Christian missions in Alaska. But not everything went so smoothly. In many villages, no lists were simply preserved, since those places were very badly damaged and in the conditions of chaos, no one had the strength or time to keep records. It was necessary to take care of the burial, establish a new life in the village and take care of numerous orphans. And this is not counting the fact that the flu did not spare the missionaries themselves, who, in theory, should have kept records. To begin the work, it was necessary to clearly identify the places where the alleged burial could be located. And with the help of the son-in-law of the head of the Department of Microbiology at Holton University, this man turned out to be a congressman and had access to the Army Meteorological Archives. Well, Holton himself wrote, having such detailed data, I could myself designate permafrost zones on maps. As a result, by putting all the components together, he was able to develop a plan. At first, I became aware of all the missions that had preserved the lists of the dead. Then I compared their location with a map of permafrost zones and realized that the search can only be conducted in 3 places. These were just 3 settlements where there were lists of those who died from the flu, and the bodies were buried in permafrost. By that time, a whole year had already passed and it was time to get ready to go, or rather to provide funding for the mission. Already in March, Holton submitted an application to the National Institute of Health in order to receive funding for his project. But a month passed, another, the third, and there was no answer. The participants began to wonder why there was no answer, but they were assured that the application was still under consideration. You just need to wait for your turn. Then Roger Porter, the same head of the microbiology department, contacted his congressman's son-in-law and asked him to find out what was really the reason for such a long wait. It turned out that Army doctors, at the suggestion of officials of the National Institute of Health, simply stole their idea and a ready-made plan. Later it turned out that they had allocated as much as $300,000 from the budget for this. Holton and all the members of the expedition were simply beside themselves with rage. And as soon as this became known, they went to the financial department of their institute and requested funding in the amount of $10,000. There they naturally got into the situation and without delay gave them this amount. Then all the members of the group, and this is Holton himself, his supervisor Maki and Jack Layton, a pathologist at the university, soon flew from Iowa to Fairfax, where they were met by Otto Gates, a loyal assistant and an indisputable authority among all local Eskimos. They had thermos flasks with wide necks filled with dry ice, and their only task was to get to the graves faster than the government mission and get those lung samples that have been resting in this icy ground for 30 years. Moreover, they stopped exactly where Holton and his wife had stayed 2 years earlier, in a university dormitory. It was decided that the head and initiator of this expedition had to go on exploration himself. Since there were only 3 potential settlements where permafrost could preserve corpses, and since due to the constant thawing of the active layer and its freezing, the rocks could push the bodies higher into the active layer. Each settlement had to be checked manually, and it was impractical to drag all the equipment and people behind them. But from the very beginning, they were faced with failure both with the stolen idea and with the weather. As soon as they landed in Fairbanks, it began to rain. It was impossible to fly in such weather, we had to wait. Day after day went by, and the rain still wasn't going to stop. Then another problem was discovered. The dry ice in the thermoses began to evaporate, and day by day they became lighter and lighter. They didn't expect to be here that long, and by the time the ice was supposed to melt, they should have been back in Iowa a long time ago. The longer we waited, the lighter our thermoses became. It's only been about 2 weeks and there's practically nothing left of the dry ice. And try to find dry ice in Alaska. The task is not easy. At first they were wildly upset, but then the problem was solved. It already seemed to us that he was advancing a catastrophe. I remember sitting in deep depression, and then I suddenly remembered that carbon dioxide fire extinguishers, when used, release a jet of white substance, which was dry ice, but in the form of a fine powder. Then they cheered up, packed up to the eyeballs with fire extinguishers, and just by the same time it stopped raining. It's time to go exploring. From Fairbanks, Holton flew straight to Nome, the very first port city in Alaska in which the Spanish outbreak broke out. It was the perfect place to search. Permafrost, a large Lutheran mission, which, by the way, regularly kept all records of the victims of the pandemic. But no, in fact, everything turned out to be not so rosy. The river that flowed in the city had changed its course so much in 20 years that it came close to the edge of the cemetery and there was practically no chance that permafrost remained there. To check, I dug a hole next to the grave. Permafrost was gone, and the members of the Army expedition, who visited the room a little later than Holton, also noted this. The bodies were at the stage of decomposition that it was not possible to detect a live virus in them, wrote Maurice Hillman. What is permafrost? It is quite described by these 2 words and represents the frozen earth forever. But there are periodic thaws, and one summer the soil can thaw by 2 feet, and the next by 6 or even 8 feet. And for such a long period of time, several cycles of warm weather have changed. In addition, the victims did not necessarily have to be buried at a great depth, where permafrost is always present. And that was the main problem for us. Holton had to leave this place and move on. Not without incidents and danger to his life, he nevertheless reached the next point of the expedition, the village of Wells, which was located on the westernmost part of the mainland, only the Bering Strait was to the left. This village was very affected by the epidemic, and upon arrival at the place, Holton found a similar picture that appeared in front of him in the room. The mass grave, in which 178 residents of the village were buried, then in 1918, stood far from the water. But the ocean had washed away the shore so much that the burial was now located right next to it. Holton tried to dig and was right in his guesses. The permafrost was gone. And there was practically no hope that undecayed remains could be found here. Then Holton went to the last place where there was at least some chance that the bodies were preserved, to Breivik. But before flying out of Wells, bad weather broke out and Holton had to stay in the village for a while. However, when it became unbearable to wait, the pilot decided to take an adventure. It was decided to first accelerate downwind along a clearly defined line, then turn against the wind and start taking off. The idea was not one of the safest, but Holton, though reluctantly, agreed anyway. Then the pilot dispersed the airplane, then turned against the wind and began to climb slowly and painfully. The plane was going so low that the landing gear touched the surface of the waves several times. I heard those sounds perfectly. Slap, 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 Holton recalled. But the adventure was still crowned with success, and they reached Breivik safely. It was here in 1918 that out of 80 people of the adult population in this village, only 5 remained. There were so many dead that for a long time the problem was simply to bury all the bodies, and it took the locals 2 whole months, and then, after a team of miners from the village arrived here. Holton received permission for exhumation from the head of the Christian mission and immediately began excavations, having been convinced by his own experience of the power of permafrost. He had to work 16 to 18 hours a day, and after 4 days he was able to dig a 6-foot hole. It's about 2 meters. The first thing he found was the body of a little girl with braided pigtails. After examining the body, he realized that it was time to call for help, which was waiting for Fairbanks. 2 days later they arrived and the work began to boil. As a result, they achieved their goal, found many well-preserved remains and delivered them with honor to the University of Iowa. This story immediately gained publicity and got into the media, and for a while Holton and other members of the expedition even gained popularity. Moreover, they managed to arrange a well-funded and organized expedition with a budget 30 times less. Then followed no less laborious and no less risky occupation. Isolate the virus. I would like to say that Holton managed to do it, but no. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he tried, he eventually failed. He crushed the tissues, placed them in a salt solution, spun them in a centrifuge to separate the virus from impurities, added antibiotics to accurately separate it from bacteria, then transplanted it into a fertilized egg and so on more than 100 times. We spent a month and a half on this before all the available material went into action. He was restless, waiting for the results to justify all the effort spent on the expedition. I remember all my sleepless nights. I just couldn't wait until morning to rush into the lab and examine the eggs. He tried to experiment on ferrets according to all the precepts of the Peugeot, but nothing gave results. I used all the samples I got, but I didn't get anything. No method worked. It became obvious that the virus was dead. There was no limit to Holton's disappointment. But science is not magic. Just as it can meet expectations, it can also destroy them. So, with the beginning of the 50s, Johann Holton gradually leaves the arena of the great flu hunters. But you probably thought again, God Looney, why did you tell us this story if it didn't lead to anything in the end? But do not rush, everything has its time. And now we should fast forward 40 years. For exactly so many years, no one has tried to repeat Holton's adventure. As the experience of previous researchers has shown, it is pointless to count on the fact that a live virus can still be preserved in bodies in permafrost. By that time, the Asian flu virus had already died out in the world, humanity had overcome smallpox, another deadly villain, the immunodeficiency virus, had shown its bloody claws. It seemed that no one else would make any attempts to identify the Spaniard and try to unravel all her secrets. But in the 90s, oddly enough, the growing threat of a new pandemic made itself felt. Fears about a new deadly strain of avian flu have been keeping infectious disease specialists awake for quite some time. In society, thoughts of the resurrection of the Spanish flu virus began to hover here and there. But how? And still in the same good old way, by digging it out of the eternal permafrost. Well, more precisely, by digging up the bodies buried in this permafrost. Then, from the partially preserved genome, build a complete sequence of nucleotides using a new polymerase chain reaction technology. Quite recently, this was impossible, but today science has grown to the point of building a complete sequence of nucleotides from an incomplete dead virus and even reviving it. But just like 40 and 50 years ago, scientists needed the material. It would probably be wrong to say that in 1918, the virus swept across the planet in such large-scale waves, and people did not leave any samples in the pathoanatomical archives at all. In fact, there were enough samples. In the 18th year, sections of lung tissue everywhere in the world were placed in university storage facilities at military units, and so on. And closer to the 90s, in one small laboratory, which was headed by one completely inconspicuous, unknown in the study of influenza, scientist Jeffrey Taubenberger became interested in him. He got his hands on an article describing the study of hereditary blindness. And not to study something there, but to study the eyes of John Dalton himself, who personally described this disease, and now it is called color blindness in his honor. John himself suffered from this disease and could not distinguish colors like all other people. Even when Dalton was alive, he tried hard to study his illness and understand why this was happening, but he ran into natural barriers. He just couldn't take and cut out his eye to examine it in detail under a microscope. Therefore, he bequeathed to his assistant after his death to cut out his eye and study whether he really looked at the world all his life as if through a color filter. He thought that the liquid in his eye, the so-called vitreous body, was not transparent, like everyone else's, but cloudy or rather even blue in color. And when Dalton died, it was time to test his hypothesis. In the end, he was certainly wrong, he had a very ordinary eye. The assistant chose another, more rational explanation at that time, but however, he did not throw away the spare parts of the great scientist and kept them in paraffin as a gift to future generations, probably. In my opinion, his remains are still kept somewhere in the John Dalton Society. Yes, there is such a thing. So the essence of the experiment was that molecular biology had made such progress by the age of 9 that scientists needed only a certain part of the genome, even just a few genes, to create a complete genome using PCR, compare it with others and understand in which gene there was a mutation and what kind of color blindness Dalton suffered from. And Jeffrey Taubenberger, being the head of a small laboratory, was thinking about how to apply this knowledge and experimental methods for the benefit of mankind. And in the light of the alarm bells that came from China and the fears of virologists about a new global flu pandemic, Jeffrey realized that all efforts should be focused on the influenza virus of 1918. Taubenberger believed that if, with the experience he had, he could isolate part of the genome from the lung samples of soldiers buried in the 18th year, he would be able to solve all the mysteries of this pandemic. Before the need to go to permafrost was still far away, then Ben Berger, along with his assistant and Reed, first of all drew attention to the repository of the Army Institute of Pathology, which was created by Lincoln himself. It was Lincoln who obliged Army doctors at one time to preserve tissues and other samples of patients, in whose case they were distinguished by their originality. In other words, when doctors could not explain what the problem was, they threw up their hands in bewilderment, pinched off a piece of the patient and put it for preservation, hoping that someday science will grow to such heights that it will be able to solve those problems that are inaccessible to them. There were stored lung tissue samples of 77 soldiers who died during the Spanish flu epidemic. But not all samples were suitable. Even if patients died from the flu, it was worth checking whether the person died 3 or 4 days after he got sick or a week or 2 later. And this was very important, since in most cases patients died at the end of the first or second week already from the effects of pneumonia, which was bacterial in nature. The virus could no longer be in the body at this moment. That is why only the most suitable cases were chosen from the entire huge list. When soldiers died a few days after infection, only in these tissues was there a chance to find that ill-fated virus. Taubenberger gathered a team in his laboratory, explained the task and work began. And if you think that in a month they have already been able to completely encode the entire genome, you are deeply mistaken. Jeffrey and his team were waiting for years of painstaking work full of disappointments and failures. Around the same time, another enthusiast appeared on the horizon. A young lady named Christy Duncan became interested in the influenza pandemic of 1918. She knew about the work that was being done in this direction and knew about the failures, including those that Taubenberger was undergoing in his laboratory. I knew that in this case there was an acute shortage of tissue samples with the possible presence of the virus, although dead, but the same virus. Christy was a geographer, taught at several Canadian universities and knew exactly where to look. She studied changes in climatic conditions and their effects on humans, and when she set out to find out if there were tissue samples left somewhere in Canada that died from the Spanish flu, it turned out that there were quite a few samples. Wherever Christy called, they answered everywhere that there was no material. And then she asked herself a new question, and where else can I get samples? And as a geographer, she knew the answer. In an extremely dry or humid environment, or in permafrost, exactly where Johann Holton once tried happiness. And it seemed more promising to her to start with Alaska. But alas, she did not have those acquaintances who helped Holton at the time. And the Geological Association of the USA did not have detailed maps of permafrost zones so that they could somehow navigate. Then she turned her eyes to Iceland, but its geothermal sources made this venture almost impossible, and she refused this option. She even tried to write to Siberia, but no one answered her there at all. Then Christy fixed her gaze on Norway, or rather on an island located at a distance towards the North Pole, just which was in the permafrost zone. That island was called Svalbard. It was there in 1994 that she had hoped when she phoned the local coal company and asked them for lists. They disappointed her by not saving anything from those times, but they encouraged her by redirecting her to a local teacher who could have kept the archives. And it was with him that she was very lucky. The archives are still preserved. Duncan called the teacher, whose name is Chelmore, and he agreed to translate several records that spoke of 7 miners who fell victims to the disease of the 18th year, resting in this land. To say that she was glad is to say nothing. She was just beside herself with happiness. And since Christy Duncan was not a timid person, unlike Taubenberg, she immediately turned to the press and a fuss arose. Just a few months after Duncan found such graves of those unfortunate miners, the whole world found out about it. The resonance was sometimes even more powerful than the resonance from active outbreaks of various diseases. Literally, the whole world was talking about the hunt for the deadly Spanish flu virus. Duncan immediately gathered a group of the most authoritative experts on Spanish, received funding, and began to develop a detailed plan for the exhumation of bodies from permafrost. This time the mission was significantly different from those undertaken earlier by enthusiasts or even professionals in their field. By the mid-90s, humanity was no longer so frivolous about various kinds of deadly viruses. And since the noise around this whole situation has gained a worldwide scale, everyone was only interested in one thing: whether this virus would break free after so many years of hibernation and whether it would do to humanity what it did to it in 1918. And you have no idea how much time it may take to ensure security in such a case. Especially when you trumpeted it to the whole world. Security concerns delayed this expedition for several years. Jeffrey Taubenberger, who works next door, but in complete informational oblivion, immediately found out about her. And even though his works were not interesting to a wide range of people yet, he had already managed to achieve some success in his business, and after publishing about him in Science, luminaries in this area paid attention to him. Now Duncan simply could not ignore his work, since she was going on an expedition to get samples that Jeffrey had already worked with. At some stage, it even shook the faith of some members of the expedition that their case makes sense at all. But everything was really not so rosy. Although Taubenberg had both samples and vast experience in this business, he still lacked the material to work with. And the more material there was, the better. And all this fuss around the flu virus forced a person who had calmed down for a long time and had time to be disappointed in this case to get involved in the case. And that guy was Albert Einstein. Just kidding. It was Johann Holton, whom we had known for a long time. All these long years he has been hiding in the shadows and carefully studied all the scientific literature in the field of microbiology. He knew that science already had a method of resurrecting viruses dormant in the abyss of time. He also knew about the existence of such a new method as polymerase chain reaction. That now, with all these achievements of science, it is possible to isolate and restore the DNA structure of the Spanish flu virus. And Taubenberg's article in Science confirms this. Meanwhile, Christy Duncan's mission was in full swing, but progress was catastrophically slow due to the media attention riveted to the situation. Every day there were more and more new problems with security, with public opinion on the situation. All processes had to be carried out according to the latest rules and regulations. Before exhumation, it was necessary to find out with the help of a new scanning system whether the graves of the miners were exactly there. Then it was necessary to provide biological protection according to the most advanced standards. That is, it was not enough to just come like Colton in the 51st year and just start digging. It was necessary to organize a laboratory equipped with a negative pressure ventilation system on the spot, publish it almost with spacesuits, and coordinate all this by all means. As a result, the mission was delayed, and it was already 1997th year in the yard, and Taubenberg's March article pushed Holton to action. Taubenberger and Duncan were direct competitors in this case. On the one hand, Duncan had worldwide fame and a mission inflated to an unprecedented scale, which had been delayed for several years. On the other hand, Taubenberger, who had already worked with samples and achieved any success. That's why Holton turned to him. He offered him an unheard-of service. 72-year-old Holton offered to go to Alaska on his own, without Jeffrey's participation, and manually dig up the remains of the Eskimos who died from the Spanish flu. The offer was, to put it mildly, stunning. Colton himself understood this, so in his letter he was very restrained and constantly made excuses that he was not writing a crazy old man who had dementia in his declining years. Taubenberger was slightly shocked, and when he asked Holton when he was going to go to Alaska, he was no less amazed. He thought that it would take the old man more than 1 month, or even a year, to gather and prepare, but he was extremely surprised when the old Swede assured him that he would be able to go literally next week. He explained such long collections by building an exact replica of a house made of logs in the style of the 14th century on his summer cottage in the mountains of Sulphur, Nevada, which, by the way, he built himself by hand. There was also a practical sense in such an incredible dedication of the old man. He wanted to do everything as quickly as possible, without wasting time on trifles, because he knew that for such a long time the flu virus simply could not stay alive. No matter how much we suffer from these terrible ailments, the flu virus is still a rather delicate thing, and at room temperature, being outside the human body, it may not live for 2 hours. Holton also took full responsibility for himself. He was a pensioner, he didn't have to risk his career either, and he just couldn't stand the eyes of the media and promised to do everything at his own expense. There will be no connection between us at all. I'll just deliver the samples and that's it. I wanted to do this work to such an extent that I tried to eliminate any, even the most unexpected obstacles from my path. To miss such a chance would be simply unforgivable. Also, everything happened in conditions of perfect secrecy. No one except Taubenberg and Holton should have known about this secret expedition. The more I thought about my plan, the more confident I became that I could handle it alone. I didn't ask any questions to anyone, except Taubenberger, and I only asked him if he would accept samples from me. I wanted to do everything as quickly as possible. While we were waiting for permits from officials, a new epidemic of influenza could break out. Arriving in Breivik, Alaska, Holton was a little saddened by how much this place had changed. There is no trace of the former authenticity left. No one else in the village was engaged in whaling, cozy yurts replaced houses, and dog sleds, snowmobiles. Each family had 1 or even 2 such cars. I have video footage of a snowmobile standing next to a sled, Holton recalls. But the sleds were already rotting. Dog sleds were becoming a relic of the past, closer to nature and a natural way of life. The people here, too, were not distinguished by their former friendliness and perseverance. The locals were completely dependent on state benefits, there was no work, and, as Holton says, this is a real tragedy. They lead an idle lifestyle, everyone has a bunch of kids, and the state pays for everything. The large number of children in families, according to Holton, is largely due to the fact that every resident of the village, including infants, receives an annual compensation of $1,800 per person in 1,996 from an oil company that is engaged in mining on their territory. But the Eskimos themselves cannot find a job, they simply have nothing to occupy themselves with. Feeling a little sad about the past, Holton set to work. Immediately after arriving in Alaska, he engaged in negotiations with the local population and obtained permission to exhume bodies buried in a mass grave in the distant 1918th year. He mentioned that in 1951 he had already come here with this mission, showed a joint photo of Sodi Som Lee, who helped him. At a meeting of the village council, Holton began with all delicacy to justify why he had come here specifically. I reminded him what terrible events had occurred in November of 1918 and informed him that I needed consent to conduct an autopsy of the grave again. Science, I said, I have now advanced so far that scientists have had the opportunity to properly study the deceased virus of the infection for later and create a vaccine so that in case of a repeat of the disaster, all local residents they received immunity and there were never any more mass deaths. The council gave its consent. In addition to this Holton, several local guys volunteered to help. Johann was surprised and extremely flattered by this event, and they immediately set to work. Just a few hours after the meeting of the village council, they were already digging with might and main in the exact place where the holding had fallen earlier. And 3 days later, they had already dug up the first corpse. To Holton's great disappointment, he decomposed, and there was practically no living tissue left on him. Then he started digging up more and more bodies and realized that the last time he dug here, he still disturbed the permafrost. Because of this, the bodies partially fell into disrepair, well, of course, from the point of view of the pathologist. The remains were preserved in different ways, some parts of the brain survived, some tissues of internal organs, but the preserved lung tissues could not be found. However, at a depth of about 7 feet, about 2 meters, Holton found the corpse of a plump woman of about 35, and next to her, on the right side, on the left, there were only skeletons or almost completely decomposed corpses, and she was not. And this discouraged Johann. He was puzzled. I sat down on an upside-down bucket and began to examine the find. I looked and almost immediately realized what was the matter. The woman suffered from excessive accuracy. She had such a dense fat layer formed under her skin and around her internal organs during her lifetime that it protected her body during brief periods of thawing of the permafrost. Those who rested next to her were not overweight and therefore their bodies decomposed. I was sitting on the fall, taking my eyes off this woman and already knowing that it was from her tissues that a virus could be extracted that would shed light on the mystery of the 1918 flu. I called her Lucy. I just remembered how Donald Johanson discovered a skeleton of a woman in the middle of the Ethiopian desert in 1974, which could clarify a lot about human evolution. He gave her the name Lucy. And I did the same, because the name comes from the Latin lux, meaning light. She will light the way for Taubenberg to discover the secret of that terrible pandemic, I thought. Holton extracted simply amazing samples from that mass grave, which, 80 years after the burial, was a very great success, and he left it as quickly as he arrived in Alaska. And when he returned home, he sent samples by mail to Taubenberg, and divided them into several parts, because he was afraid that the parcel might get lost and not reach him, which would mean an invaluable loss for science as a whole. In general, it's funny that Holton sent samples of one of the most dangerous viruses in the world by regular mail. Let it be in the past, but still, it is clear that the virus was already dead in the 51st year. But the same Duncan expedition was delayed for 4 whole years precisely because they tried as best they could to ensure the safety of the expedition, so that in no case would the virus break free and do things. And some pensioner who alone, having spent only $3,000 on the road, did what a whole pack of professionals had been preparing for 4 years. For me, this is a real feat, and this time Holton could proudly reap the fruits of his labor. Lucy's perfectly preserved samples went to a good cause and helped Taubenberg to completely sequence the genome of the virus of 1918, which opened the veil of secrecy that tormented scientists for decades. And if we go back to the Christie Duncan expedition, it took place in August of 1998. And it was not an exhumation, but a whole carnival. Scientists with technicians and workers, as well as hundreds of journalists, documentaries and TV reporters arrived at the scene of the events. Duncan just couldn't hold back the bursting foam. He called back every minute. During the exhumation, she constantly had to give interviews, and then hold press conferences every morning. But no matter how much hype there was around this case in the media and in the scientific world, the results still turned out to be disappointing. It turned out that the rocks during the thaw and subsequent freezing pushed the coffins higher, and they were already outside the permafrost zone, which meant a complete failure for the mission. It was almost impossible to find the necessary preserved fabrics. So, 5 years of preparation, $500,000, planning and mobilization of almost all the media in the world have sunk into the abyss and almost for nothing. However, during this time, new methods of working with such dangerous viruses have been developed, which in general was even useful for science. And science, it's not always some grandiose achievements, it happens very often. To achieve a result, sometimes you need to suffer thousands of defeats. And this, unfortunately, was one of them. 7 years later, Taubenberg managed to uncover the full chain of the Spanish flu virus. It happened on the 6th of October, 2005, and articles in 2 of the most popular scientific journals in the world, Science and Nature, will confirm this. The article in Nature said that Jeffrey and his team had managed to decipher the complete sequence of the virus and the Spanish flu, and the article in Science said that they had managed to recreate this monster in the laboratory. And not only to recreate, but also to infect mice with this virus, well, human lung tissue grown in petri dishes. The journey of 10 years for Taubenberg himself and 55 years for Holton ended successfully. However, before publishing the results of the research and the entire sequence of the virus genes, they had to take permission to recreate this virus, because it posed a huge threat to society. But no matter how people were afraid to release a monster, and in fact the flu virus was really dangerous, but many modern flu viruses originated from it in one form or another, from which we somehow have immunity, since it was a virus stamp already 1N1, which is part of annual vaccines for many years in a row. Taubenberger himself noted that the Spanish flu virus is the most classic bird flu virus that mutated into a human one somewhere around the turn of the century, gradually changing the structure of its surface proteins hemagglutinin and neuraminidase so that it could be transmitted not from a bird to a person, as it is doing now as many as 5N1, but directly from person to person, which made it so dangerous for us. And I must say, for this, the Spanish flu virus needed nothing at all. Small changes in 25 to 30 of the 4,000 amino acids and the virus has become a merciless killing machine. Of course, many other things influenced all this. For example, the fact that the virus was in fact in birds until 1918. Perhaps that's why people didn't understand why everyone was sick at once and were looking for answers in natural anomalies. And perhaps because when a huge mass of people were forced to travel from one country to another, violating quarantine at the same time. For example, how Australia suffered from the third wave of flu. And not only Australia, many countries. In 1918, she maintained strict quarantine, but when the war ended and soldiers began to return home en masse, the pandemic seized her with renewed vigor. Plus, the difficult conditions of trench warfare, when soldiers were forced to stay in dirty trenches for a long time without access to medical care, not to mention quarantine. The abnormal reaction of the body to the new stamp also did its job. The fact that the flu of 1918 killed mostly young people was explained by the fact that it quickly caused a hyperactive immune reaction in the body, the so-called cytokine storm, which I talked about in the video about Ebola. This reaction makes vulnerable those who are young, full of strength and whose immune system is in full combat mode, while the elderly and children with their weak immunity suffer less. Well, the lack of antibiotics at that time was also a big trouble. Now we know that if we suddenly have a risk of developing pneumonia against the background of flu or a cold, we are more likely to cure such a person, even though this condition is still dangerous. But at that time, alas, antibiotics had not yet been invented, and the risk of dying from the most common, as it may seem to us now, cough was extremely high. The low mortality of the older generation in the pandemic of the 18th year is also explained by the fact that the previous generation, which was born in the 19th century and caught the pandemic of the Russian flu of the 1892 years, had immunity from influenza. But in fact, after so many years of searching for answers, there is still a lot of question. Will we be able to prevent the next pandemic, and what will it be like? We don't know. We don't even know which side it will come from. In order to get better acquainted with the topic, I advise you to watch my videos about Ebola and about the flu virus. There I generally tell you what viruses are, and specifically about the flu virus. You can also watch my video about antibiotics. There, in general, I tell you how they help us and what diseases they help to fight, and how they help us to deal with the complications that the flu can cause. And many thanks to all those who support me with donations and on Patreon. You are all great fellows, and it is thanks to you that such content exists. And if you continue to have a desire to support me, then all the necessary links will be in the description. Thank you all for watching, and bye to everyone.